Lucy, I'll just start by saying a big thank you for agreeing to join us for an episode of The Responsible Edge this morning. I know you and I met back in the summer.
I know.
You had a party last night, so clearly times have changed. Yeah, the temperature, the weather has shifted somewhat. It's fantastic to have you on. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant stuff. So, Lucy, as you know, first sort of 20 minutes or so, we just want to do a real deep dive into getting to know you and sharing your story with our listeners. So, it'd be great, wherever you want to start, just give us a flavor of you and your background, and in particular, highlighting perhaps the role that ethics, responsible practice, sustainability has played in you deciding to do what you've done.
Absolutely. So I think probably the easiest place to start is that I started my career in advertising. And so way back when, I actually started at Ogilvy, so one of the big kind of Mad Men style agencies, which actually was not very Mad Men because it was not the 60s, but it was a brilliant grounding, I think, in communications, in marketing, in understanding human behavior. Basically, they had a behavior practice that was just taking off at the time. So I learned a lot, but I think I definitely got to a point a few years in where I was kind of like, oh, what's all this for? All these great ideas, all this great energy, but actually we're just selling products or we're just selling broadband, which is obviously very, very important. But for me personally, I was kind of feeling a little bit like I wanted something a little bit more in terms of having a positive impact in particular. And also I think thinking about how to do that in a way that was sort of quite good for either businesses or brands, or various kind of different sectors as well. So actually what I did initially after that was I then went and worked with a third sector specialist. So working on fundraising in particular. And what I loved there was it was interesting because although I was away from business, I was working with some brilliant brands and some brilliant organizations. And I think what kind of fundamentally is always the question when you work with charities is how do we get people to care? Which in many cases it's not that hard because it's quite emotive, but there's always a degree of that question at the heart of it, which I found really fascinating and kind of reignited a bit of a passion in terms of human behavior. And then I think you can kind of see how the thread then came through to thinking about, well, how do we actually get people to care about climate change and things like that?
Well, Lucy, let me just stop you slightly there and just pry into the Ogilvy and then moving into working in the third sector. How did it feel and how did it sort of impact you going from how do we sell this broadband, if you like, services product, to how do we get people to care about this cause? Like, did that begin to service that need in you for more impact, more sort of significance in terms of the work that you were doing? Just talk us through that feeling that you went through, realizing that.
Exactly. Yeah, that was it. It was realizing that the work just suddenly felt so much more meaningful. Not that it wasn't, not that it didn't have a purpose before, but now it really did have a purpose. And it's actually I think it's quite interesting. And a lot of people who I've worked with around in this sort of sector have also remarked on it, that it can be quite emotional when you're working particularly on causes where, you know, the storytelling is can be quite tough and quite evocative. And so, it can be quite an emotional experience. And actually, I think the same can be said. There's definitely a parallel there now working in climate change and hearing people who are saying, oh yeah, it's actually, you get sort of climate burnout in the same way, but it's that hope that keeps you going, which I think is definitely very similar.
So okay. So I feel like it's really, when you talk through your career, there is a really nice sort of timeline of events, isn't there? So we've worked at Ogilvy, we've built a really solid foundation and understanding around comms and advertising and the impact that it can have, but perhaps we want to apply that to something that's a bit more impactful. We move into the third sector. What happens next?
What happens next is I loved working there, but I think at the time there was quite a lot of insight coming out that actually where people were looking in terms of which sort of actors were going to have positive impact on the world, actually charities was ranking lower than businesses. And there was definitely a bit of a penny drop moment where I went, if I want to be an impact, actually the people who do have the influence and the power are probably going to be corporations and businesses. And so then I made the move into working at more of a purpose specialist. So focusing a lot more on sort of corporate social purpose, and also a lot on employee culture change as well. But thinking a lot about what's that role that businesses can play that's positive, but also how can that really support businesses in terms of driving value as well, and sort of trying to reconcile those two things and beginning to see purpose and social impact and ultimately sustainability as well to a slightly lesser extent. How can that drive actual sort of value for shareholders, for corporations, for employees, for customers, for everyone? That was really, really, really fascinating to me. And then most
win-win situations that you're aiming for. Sorry, I was going to say that ultimately pulling together the sort of the win-win-win situations for all stakeholders.
Exactly.
That conundrum, if you like, when it comes to marketing and comms. So when did sustainability sort of rear its head, if you like, and become significant for you?
So I think sustainability was always there, and it was a big part of the work that I was doing on purpose. And in many ways, it was almost the sort of the fundamental sort of strong, robust underpinnings of something that can sometimes get a bit bad rap for being quite fluffy. But I think what really shifted for me was a year or two ago was just speaking to clients and how much the regulatory pressure inside of sustainability was coming in. And it's something that has always been sort of there in the background for me, or has been an important part of what I do. I also very originally did a geography degree, so this is very much a full circle moment in many respects. But I think
at Bristol University.
Bristol. Yeah.
Very good. How did you enjoy Bristol? Just
I loved it. Yeah, it's lovely. It's a mega city. It's really, really lovely. Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Excellent. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. You were.
Oh no worries. What was I? About regulation, and yeah, basically, I think I was quite aware that a lot of the clients I was working with were spending an awful lot of time and money and resources getting compliant, getting ready for CSRD and all these big scary things coming in. And actually, I really wanted to be in that space because I was thinking, you know what, we're going to have all of this data. We're going to have all of this need once we've like set up all the measurements. And there's that sort of adage of, you only manage what you measure. Actually, I want to be there for the managing side of it. How can we use the sort of communications and engagement skills that I found to actually like affect positive change when we're starting to measure things and scrutinize things in a bit more detail. So yeah, that's it. That's it in a nutshell.
Well, that really is a nutshell, Lucy. I want to ask you. So, and this just describe for our listeners exactly what Sillion does and what your role is at Sillion.
Yeah, for sure. So Sillion is a sort of sustainability advisory, but we really specifically focus on transition and transition planning, amongst other things. But that's kind of our big focus at the moment. I think what makes Sillion quite interesting as a sustainability advisory is it's this real mix of skill sets. So we've got a very technical ESG team who are really on top of the regulations, really on top of sort of more of the sort of strategic underpinnings of sustainability strategies and plans. We have a modeling team, which is really great. They do some really brilliant things in terms of actually sort of modeling different scenarios, also modeling potential financial impacts and costs and things like that. And then we have my team, which is the communications team. And our role is basically, it's quite broad in terms of communications disciplines, but our role is basically taking what's often quite sort of technical concepts or, I guess, very focused on regulation and trying to think about, okay, how do we communicate these for different stakeholders in a way that feels relevant, feels understandable, feels insightful and inspiring to them. So that can range from sort of talking to investors, employees, customers, sort of external media. So really broad in terms of audiences, but always with that sort of that core of sustainability at the heart of the communications.
Fantastic, Lucy. Fantastic. And out of interest, because obviously that's a particular area of interest for us, like what have been in the work that you guys have done over the last few years, you mentioned regulation, you mentioned almost at times, I guess, from a comms perspective, when you're handed a sustainability report or an impact report and you're tasked with thinking about how you go about communicating this as effectively as possible, can sometimes be quite a difficult challenge in terms of the dryness of what's been put in front of you. Like, what have been those kind of key themes and trends for you over the last few years working on the comms side of things?
I think the first thing is to try and ensure that what's put in front of you as a report is not that dry to start with. But assuming that it is still, I'd say the first thing is, and I think often what happens with sustainability is everyone kind of can sometimes forget some of the basics of comms, which is start with your audience. What's your audience interested in? What's going to make them tick? What's going to make them care? Again, coming back to that. And I think the second big thing with sort of sustainability is what's going to make them take action, because ultimately the vast majority of communications are about saying, okay, this is our progress. This is what we've done. This is where we want to get to. And ultimately, that's not something that can be delivered by a tiny little sustainability team within an organization. And I think that's been the big shift I've seen in the last couple of years, is how it feels like sustainability is something that's now, it's not just a sustainability team's business, it's everyone's business. And everyone has a role to play. So I think making it really clear what that role is and what's either expected or encouraged of different actors is also really important. It's the so what or the what next of reporting and disclosure that really interests me, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Lucy. We had a chap called Nick, who's he's the president of the Green Angel Syndicate, based in the UK, and we had him on Nick Live, I think it is. We had him on the show yesterday. This will be coming out, I think. But he was talking about exactly the same need, if you like, in terms of how we go about communicating these things. So I think that's fascinating. Lucy, I want to you jumped straight into, when we talking about you, into I guess giving a lot of clarity around the steps that you've taken throughout your career. I want to ask you a few kind of more personal questions here about the impact. No, don't worry, not too personal. But more around like the experiences that you've had during your life that have focused your attention on some of the big issues at play, climate change, other sort of sustainability related issues. Like, can you recount for us like any moments that really shone a light for you? You mentioned working in the third sector and the emotive experiences that you had of sharing some of the stories there. Just touch upon like any other experiences that you had that really really hit things home for you in terms of why this stuff is so important.
Oh, that's a really tricky one, because I feel like there are so many, aren't there? I have always really loved going to the west coast of Scotland. We went there as a family when I was really, really little, and I have always had like a massive love of the sort of wildlife that's up there. And the thing that I found so interesting is, in all those years, we sort of used to go out and see whales, see birds, see all sorts of different beautiful creatures. Like, they have killer whales up there, which is like, it's crazy. It's the UK. And I think what I found particularly sort of tricky over the last few years is every time we go up, we see a bit less. And then there are stories of like, oh no, well, this family of whales is dying out, and there's still going to be orcas in the UK, but not those ones. Or I think there've been times where we've just not seen as many sort of birds or the bird life, which is, there are multifaceted sort of reasons for that, and a lot of it is there's more disease, there's more, like, the migratory patterns have been sort of disrupted. But actually, when you kind of go back to it, often climate change is at the heart of it. It's it's hotter here, or it's colder there, or it's this sort of current has been disrupted in a way, or this piece of land isn't available for them anymore, or they're not able to access that food. And suddenly it was that moment of going, okay, climate change can be this really complex thing that feels like it's something happening with big global weather systems. But actually then it's when you see actually all those different impacts then coming together for one particular kind of species or wildlife group, it feels very real and tangible. So that for me has definitely been a bit more of a sort of a personal motivator as well.
Just for our listeners to have a sort of view in mind, sort of which part of the west coast of Scotland do you normally?
My goodness. So we spent quite a lot of time up in Mull, on the Isle of Mull, but also kind of going out to some of the sort of Outer Hebrides as well, which are just I'd massively recommend them. They're the most beautiful place on earth. I think I'm probably very biased, but yeah, it's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
No, I think I saw a Ben Fogle show a couple of nights ago that was featuring the Outer Hebrides, and it was stunning.
God, right.
I'm not being myself, but I can back it up. Ben Fogle's an absolute good. Just shout out Ben. Lucy, that's really interesting. I've a question that sort of came up as you were describing that there. You brilliantly described how there's multifaceted issues and multifaceted problems that are going on around the world, but ultimately a lot of it can come back to climate change. This actually came out of the conversation with Nick yesterday as well, so I'm going to use this to inspire the question. His perspective was that essentially this whole notion of ESG is a confusion in many ways, because essentially the S and the G are only relevant or only important unless we address the E. And ultimately, we're confusing ourselves by focusing on really too much of a broad spectrum of things. And we need to focus in on the absolute critical notion of climate change and carbon reduction. What's your take on that? Do you think that that we're distracted in the sustainability space by the S and the G, or do you think that there's a part to be played there as well?
I think there is a part to be played there. I think I'm probably going to disagree a little bit. I do agree that, if you've got to start somewhere, the E is the place to start. But I think that it's almost like, it's a bit like a car. You can't have a car with just an engine. You need a car with an engine and a steering wheel and a wheel as well. And all three of them have to work together to make the car run. And I know that that's a horribly fossil fuel loaded analogy.
I love it. But crucially, it's an EV car, isn't it?
It's an EV car. Yeah, it's a plug-in. But I think that's the thing. And I think for so long, actually, we've lacked proper governance. Actually, that's been the thing that's been missing. And that's what's led to this huge rise in greenwash. It's what's led to so much skepticism, actually, as well, in terms of environmental claims, in terms of the sort of the quote unquote green agenda. And so I think that it is a really critical part. And I also think that you cannot have a transition that doesn't have the S involved in it, because it has to be a just transition. It has to be a transition that takes everyone with it. So I do think that all three are intrinsically sort of interlinked and important. What I do think has been a distraction is I think that there has been this sort of proliferation of these technical terms and this like acronym soup of ESG, CSRD, RF, everything is an acronym, and it just makes it feel so complicated, and it is complex. But I think that there have been very few attempts to kind of try and break this down into something that feels manageable. There have been attempts, but there has also been quite a lot of complexity behind it. And so I think trying to navigate away from this world where sustainability is sort of the land of people who get their heads around all these acronyms, and actually getting into this space of, okay, what does this mean for you in your company, in your job, in your buying habits? That's the stuff that I think has probably been the distraction, rather than maybe the S and the G.
Well, Lucy, first of all, I'm going to shout out to Nick and say, Nick, I'm so sorry if I completely misrepresented your...
Also, sorry, Nick.
No. You responded to that beautifully, Lucy, absolutely beautifully. Let me ask you on that, in terms of the word soup, why has that happened in your mind? Like, why have we got ourselves to the point where we've got this over-technical, over-engineered dialect, if you like, that underpins the sustainability agenda?
I think it's really challenging. And I think there are probably a number of reasons, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in answering all of this. But I think that first and foremost, climate change is fundamentally it is complex. Scientifically, it is complex. And it's something that I think I was taught in school, but not everyone was taught in school. And I think the science has also been evolving, but also it's quite hard to get your head around, because it's not, I mean, the example I gave just there of the sort of the wildlife in the West Coast, yeah, that's visible, but you don't see it happening in the way that you can see a war happening. You can't.
Mm.
And I think that has been the challenge that a lot of people have grappled with for a very long time. And therefore, I think a big focus as well when it comes to communications has been about explaining that and explaining what it is, what the impact is, how it works, and so almost sort of having to raise awareness of what has been up until quite recently, like not necessarily an invisible problem, but not a super tangible problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably one side of it. And then I think the other side is because it's been something that then got people's attention so much, particularly I'd say on the consumer side. I think that then there was just this sort of proliferation of brands and companies wanting to talk about it and wanting to say what they were doing and making green claims, and almost there was this sort of movement towards doing a lot, and then that had to be pulled back with regulation a little bit, or not pulled back, but I'd say guardrails put in place in terms of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in doing that, it meant that suddenly there was an awful lot of different things happening simultaneously because it had to happen quite quickly. Yeah, so I'd say those are probably the two things, but I'm sure there are many more reasons why. But yeah.
But Lucy, I love that. I think that's clearly those are two very significant factors. So thank you for shaping that for us. As expected, we've absolutely rattled through 20 minutes on you, but I have got one final question.
Yeah, go for it.
And I ask this to the majority of my guests because I think it is an interesting point for kind of reflection. Lucy, when you get to the end of your career and you look back on what you've done, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
Oh my goodness, it's a really tricky question, and it's one that's very hard to answer without feeling like you want to be very, I don't know, very wholesome.
Nick said yesterday, he said, when you've got British guests on answering that question, we all just sort of break down a little bit. It's the Americans that we've had on that seem to be more comfortable. But yeah, just give you, be interested to hear just your thoughts on that.
I think the biggest thing is to be able to look back and say, I was on the right side of history. I did what I could. And I think that's the thing is I feel like there's been such a sort of a demonization of this poor boomer generation of like, oh, look what you've done. And actually we all have this opportunity right now to make a positive impact. And actually I think to do that in a way that is going to be good for business, good for so many different aspects, good for business, good for citizens, good for governments. There are just so many ways that we can do this that are positive. And I don't want to be sitting here going, oh yeah, you know what, I was part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. And I don't necessarily want to be, and I think I'm quite happy to be quite quietly part of the solution. I don't think I necessarily want to be the person who, invent something. And I think actually something that is quite interesting about this is that I think there's no space for egos in sort of sustainability. This is about actually just quietly, well, not always quietly, but just getting on with it and doing the right thing and being able to say, yeah, no, we all did club together and make an impact and collaboratively have the best impact that we possibly could for the planet. That's a bit rambling, but I think that's probably what it is.
Lucy, I love that. And I tell you what I love about that is that I don't know if you've had a similar experience to me, but I feel like that lack of ego, if you like, or that humility, I think that is a commonality in people working in the sustainability space. Like from my experience, like you meet lots of people that are doing brilliant things. You're massively underplaying the brilliance of the work that you're doing. And yet it's so refreshing, I think, to work in a space alongside colleagues and contacts that view it that way. There's a collective goal that sort of provides context for all of our individual contributions.
Completely. And that's actually one of the things I love so much about working in this space is everywhere you go, you don't get that feeling of competition, or everyone is so open and wants to share their stories of success, of failure. Everyone's really open and really collaborative and welcoming, because I think everyone who's in this space recognizes that this is not about one person, one company doing better than another. It's actually about us all coming together and solving this as a whole, which I think is is a really important mindset.
Which, Lucy, perfectly segues us on to talking about a key theme that's
Yes.
drawn out of, I think, the article that we're going to discuss.
Yes.
You're one of these brilliant guests where it's just like it flows into the next bit absolutely perfectly. So I think I'm going to butcher this, and I apologize to Claudia, but it was Claudia de Melamesta in the FT Sustainable Views publication in October 2024.
Yes.
Lucy, would you mind just providing our listeners with an overview of what the article covered? Perhaps just also explaining a little bit about what a transition plan actually is, I think for our listeners would be helpful. And then just picking out from the article, what were the most interesting or salient points for you?
Yeah, so beware, because there's acronym soup coming here, but I will try and avoid too many of those. So the article was about the Transition Plan Task Force, which was a sort of a body that was set up in 2022 by the government, and it was basically saying that their remit and work has come to an end, and they have published their final report, and then that work is going to be absorbed into IFRS, so the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation's guidance moving forward. But the TPT, Transition Plan Task Force, have been publishing guidance on what a good transition plan should look like, what it should involve, and also giving some really good. I've found them particularly useful in the sense that they've been compiling some really good best practice examples of what great plans look like. So definitely a great place to still check out for a view of what a good transition plan looks like. But coming on to your second question about transition plans. So I think transition plans in many ways are kind of a bit of an evolution of what we've probably been calling sustainability strategies for a while. But I think they're much more focused on the action. So they're the bridge between the commitments that you set out and the sort of actual corporate action that you then take. So a way of maybe thinking about this is it's a bit like your I guess because we're recording in December, so thinking ahead to January. Often in January, you start by saying, right, these are my New Year's resolutions, and I'm going to sign up to the gym. That almost is sort of your sustainability strategy. That's setting out your commitments. And then a transition plan is almost like your training plan to get you there. It's then what you then go and do. It's the steps that you will take over the next months or years or whatever in order to actually achieve those ambitions. So it's kind of taking, I think, particularly in line with, I think there was definitely a moment a few years ago when a lot of people were setting net zero targets and kind of going, oh, yeah, we'll get there. 2035 is a while away. This is about, okay, actually, how are we going to get there? What are going to be the markers along the way? What are going to be the actions we take? And also critically, and this is where comms comes in, who are the people that we need to engage in order to make that a reality?
Fantastic, Lucy. Thank you so much for not only explaining it so clearly, but managing to use a timely analogy to describe it. You're brilliant. Your car analogies and New Year's resolutions.
So many analogies.
Oh, I love it. Where are we going to go next?
Who knows?
Lucy, that was brilliant. And thank you for providing the context. From this report or from, well, in fact, let's start with the article. Was there anything in particular from this piece that really struck you and that, is really sort of affected the way that you're working on things at Sillion?
I think there wasn't anything that actually especially struck me. I think what was good was, I think it sort of cemented a lot of things that we were already thinking about or were aware of. I think one of the encouraging things was the number of businesses who have already been building transition plans and putting them in place. That was encouraging because I think that at the moment, I mean, the report kind of covers a global remit, but when you think about Europe and the UK in particular, it does feel like we have been really, really focused on disclosure reporting rather than necessarily looking ahead to the next step in the transition planning, which I think was encouraging to see. I think it was something like almost 6,000 businesses have already committed and published transition plans, which was really, really good. I think what was also really key in the report was there was a lot of talk about, okay, now's the time that this needs to become more mainstream, which yes, we agree with. And it's really encouraging to. I feel like this has been something that Sillion we've been talking about. I mean, before even I joined, for over a year, saying, yeah, this is going to be coming. This is going to be the next thing, and actually to hear it being said that, like, yep, this is definitely still coming. It was encouraging as well. But I think that what was also interesting was hearing, I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, but the report does call for this need to actually enforce transition plans, make sure that they're compliant, which of course that's the thing. There's no point in kind of guidance without guardrails. So yeah, I think again, so nothing that was super surprising, but a lot was encouraging and really good to see, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what about, you mentioned, Lucy, there about, I think the article alluded to, looking at things more globally and looking at particular efforts in Australia and Brazil, I think, that were particularly picked out in the piece regarding the impact of transition reports. Like, how does, taking your kind of UK European view and thinking about transition planning more globally, like, what's your take on where we are from a global perspective, not just perhaps from a UK or EU point of view?
I think it's a really tricky and nuanced question for sure. And actually what's been quite interesting is seeing some sort of new regulations being announced in Australia in the last couple of months. And suddenly this moment of businesses in Australia, I know from the anecdotes we've heard going, oh God, yeah, we need to get going with some stuff. But I think that there is definitely a little bit of an element of, I think Europe and the UK kind of have to lead the way on this. In many ways, we have the privileged position of having more established sustainability sort of functions, plans, and goals. And I think that it's really important to see a few different organizations in different sectors start to publish these and start to really sort of like put their stake in the ground so that the others can follow. I think as well, what's so interesting is that it's been a lot of the global companies that are taking some of the first leaps. I know Unilever have published a transition plan that's really strong, and there've been many others. And so I think being able to already see examples where you see businesses who have that global footprint, who are actually looking at this as something beyond their or beyond one geography, being able to see how all of these different geographies and almost like which levers they need to pull in different markets in order to actually have that combined effect, I think is really important.
Yeah, and incredibly encouraging, as you say. And if the EU and the UK in particular can lead on this, what a brilliant impact and a brilliant contribution that could be made. Let me ask you though about, I think one of the other things the article kind of covered, which I thought was particularly interesting, and you've spoken about before during the show. It talked about like the need for that kind of collaboration, if you like, between 100%. Government and policymakers and ultimately the corporates that are at play. Just touch on that. Like, what do you see the trends being, and what do you see the requirements being in terms of moving forward, ensuring transition planning actually has the effect it's going to have in light of the relationships between governments, corporates, policymakers?
Again, complex space, but I can try and break down maybe just a few things. I think firstly, so much of this is going to require a sort of an openness, and actually almost thinking about that openness that sustainability professionals have had, that needs to go through into transition planning. I think sharing that or what you're doing, or sharing and having that transparency of the actions that you're taking and the plans that you're putting in place is going to be really, really essential. And so I think even actually just sort of publishing transition plans gets you a little bit of the way there to start with, because you are going to be disclosing and being so much more open about so much more. I think the other thing that is becoming really interesting is that a lot of transition plans actually require businesses or the organizations who write them to sort of express and explain like what their role is beyond actually sort of the purpose of their company, but actually to explain their role in society. And actually ITV have a really great example of this, where they talk about actually their role in the transition is not just, to make content in a way that's sort of going to drive to net zero, but actually it's the role they can play in inspiring other audience groups or working with different stakeholder groups as well. So
Fantastic.
I think there's quite a lot of interesting aspects there. And then probably the last example I'd look to is New Zealand as a country. Their sort of Department of I think ecology. Oh God, I've probably got that wrong. But they actually have set out their own transition plan, and they have a really good example of what a great one can look like, because they've got these sort of interactive dashboards on their government website. And I just
Cool.
thought that's such a brilliant way of a government actually sort of like taking on board the need to be communicating transition plans, but also helping people understand what some of the things are that they can do differently, or how that can all sort of fit together in more of this whole, and being almost like this convening piece of information. I
Mm.
thought was a really strong role for a government to play as well.
And Lucy, again, it comes back to your like an underlying theme throughout this conversation
Yeah,
of the accessibility of these initiatives through
100%.
communication and the importance of that.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you about, I want to ask you about transition plan. We I think, yeah, we had a show a few weeks ago, which was astonishing, where we were talking to a chap called Tom Carr
Mhm.
from SB and Co, and he was talking about, I think the article that we were looking at was a Deloitte piece that that suggested that of the FTSE 100 companies, we had, I think, 47 restatements over the last year.
Yeah, that doesn't
And
surprise
when they
me.
did an analysis relating to why that was the case, I might be getting these numbers wrong, by the way,
No,
before anybody.
don't worry, go for
I
it.
think it was around like 70% was down to methodology changes and
Yeah,
30% was down to pure human error.
yeah.
So taking the fact, and then we talked about the term clumsy, and I love the term clumsy, like applied to this, because I think it's just so truthful and real in terms of where
Yeah,
we are broadly as the sustainability agenda. Not perhaps the term that you typically hear people talking about in a corporate setting, but therefore I think it's got real power. With a transition plan,
mm,
what's your experience of an organization has set these goals and objectives, they've
mm.
worked out how they're going to realize them. What happens when things go wrong? What happens when those numbers are not realized, or when that planning that they put in place isn't enacted? Like, from a comms perspective, what do you do?
I think the first thing that you have to do is engage with your stakeholders and understand why things go wrong. Because I think in many cases, yes, methodologies are more now sophisticated now, which is why we're getting to better calculations. But I think that one of the really big things that transition planning places a focus on is the need for engagement. And actually, when you look at where the need to decarbonize is, it's something like, in many cases, it's something like 40% comes from sort of supply chain or supplier engagement. And
Mm.
actually, if things are going wrong, a great place to start is to speak to your suppliers and find out why that is. And actually, I think there's something really interesting that's maybe been overlooked a little bit, which is in terms of how to engage with suppliers to get the right data and to get accurate data. But more than
Mm.
that, not just how do you get the right data and disclosure from them, but how do you get them to or spark action or think about things differently. So that for me is one of the first places that I would look at. I think there's obviously an external comms job to be done to kind of explain why you haven't met that target and why that's happening. But I would first of all start with engaging with your stakeholders. I think thinking a little bit more about that, how do you explain it outwardly? I think there are some really great examples of this, and I think actually one that's been really interesting is looking at how Microsoft have been talking about data centers.
Mm.
So they've actually seen bizarrely an increase in their emissions in their scope 3 in the last few years, and a big part of that is because of the rise of AI. And actually, I think the best thing that you can do in that situation is be really honest, be really open, and say, look, this is why this is happening. This is why it's gone up. These are the steps that we're going to take to then reduce it. Because if you try and sort of cover it up and say, oh yeah, but the methodology's changed, or this has happened, or blah, 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 I think people are now sort of much more, they're going to scrutinize that. Journalists are going to scrutinize it much more, and actually the public are going to scrutinize it much more. So I think it is about being open and being transparent about it as much as it is about telling a good story.
Lucy, that's really you've thank you. That's you've addressed that beautifully, and another great example. I'm going to ask you a slightly cheeky question, and feel free to back and say absolutely not. But
Yeah.
okay, this is a cheeky question, but we talked to, we've spoken to lots of people working in, broadly sustainability communications, if you like,
Yeah.
on the show and through the work we do at the Charter.
Mm.
And there's this like consistent view applied in different contexts that the need for transparency, honesty, openness,
Sure.
etc., that almost the liberation that can occur through negating, if you like, any bad
Yeah.
sort of views of what you're doing by being as transparent and open and honest as possible.
Yeah.
Slightly cheeky question: are there any instances or examples where, and I'm not just talking about transition planning here, but where an organization shouldn't be open, honest, and transparent about their position? Or is that just a thing of the past and something that is no longer applicable?
No, I don't think it's I don't think it's a case of not being transparent. I don't think this is about hiding. I
Mm,
think I think what I'd rephrase it as is it is really, really important to address this with the right kind of sense of nuance. Because
mm,
I think that's where the challenge is that we're still working in a media landscape where headlines sell, headlines get clicks, and often then a lot of nuance can be lost. So I do understand there is a risk with going out, yes, with a transparent press release and saying, yeah, this is where we screwed up, because if there's someone's then going to try and distill that down into something which readers want to read, they're going to try and find the juicy angle. I get that. That's how this works. This is what I read as well.
mm,
Um, so I don't think it's as simple as saying brush it under the carpet, because also what we're hearing so much more from particularly investors, actually. We run a report every year with people sort of from more of the investor side, looking at what they want to see from sustainability reports. And the number one thing from the conversations we had this year was, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. I need to see some kind of transparency in there. So there's definitely scrutiny on it. If it all sounds too good to be true, it's going to be called out for it. But equally, I think it's really hard to say, yep, let's just go full openness. I think there's still a need for some good comms to explain some of that nuance and to be able to say, okay, maybe we didn't get this bit right, but here's what we're doing about it. Here's what we're
mm,
doing to meet those expectations. Here's what we learned. Here's the here are the steps. And also, this is where a really great transition plan can come in, because it actually gives you that sort of underpinning where if something goes a little bit wrong, it gives you something really strong to point to say, but look at
mm.
the steps that we're going to be taking to get to where we need to get to. But unfortunately, we can't flip that switch overnight and be perfect. It's going to take a considered effort.
Lucy, it's brilliant to hear you describing that. It's exactly, we have a mandatory section in our green claims policies that we develop with
Yeah,
our signatories of the Charter now that is literally where we can improve. And it's
exactly.
actually now the first section within a green claims policy. So before we get into how we go about communicating all the great things that we're doing, we're going to acknowledge and accept upfront those areas where we could improve.
Exactly.
And I think I think for me, and I don't know if you agree with this, but the term disarming comes through. It is a
Yeah,
disarming action where being proactive in your disclosure
yeah,
allows you to disarm and create a communications context which is ripe for effective comms about what you're doing positively.
100%.
I'm pleased that you do kind of take that. I'm sorry, I rambled on a little bit.
No, it's great.
But I was inspired by what you said. Lucy, we've rattled through things as expected. It's been an absolute flyby conversation. We always finish with the magic wand question, though. So, Lucy, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the corporate world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Oh, this is really hard to express, but I would, you know what? The one thing I think could make the biggest difference is some sort of like universal sustainability language. I think so much gets lost because we can't speak to each other. We have sustainability people who really struggle to speak to finance departments who just don't get it, communications people who just don't get it either, or are trying to get it. And I actually think if there was a one beautiful little easy to speak language that we could all adopt, that would be awesome. I think that would just break down so many barriers. It would break down so many silos, and it would just create so much more impact, because ultimately I think all of these different stakeholder groups are often on the same page. They want the same things. They want good value for whichever audience they represent, and they want to do it probably in a way that doesn't destroy the planet and therefore jeopardize creating future value. That's what it boils down to. Realistically, different motivations within that, but I think finding that shared language, finding that shared common ground is going to be one of the biggest unlocks for these challenges.
Lucy, that is an absolutely sensational magic wand. The magic wand has had an absolute battering over the course of the last 70 odd episodes. And there are certain uses of it that I've perhaps, they've all been good, but I think that is a particularly strong and sort of practical suggestion. And I think I love it. It draws full circle back to a sort of a real key theme throughout today's conversation of accessibility and of use of language facilitating that. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know this is your first podcast. I know our listeners will be absolutely listening out for your next. But thank you for coming on this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been such an interesting conversation.